for a long time for Donald Trump, strategic ambiguity has been part of his negotiating strategy. But the problem is when you get to an actual peace agreement that has to be implemented on the ground, you need concrete words on paper. Hey guys, hey Courtney, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you. And Baron, you're back from Mexico. Good to have you back.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Yeah, well, certainly you came back to plenty of news, but we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, August here in DC is supposed to be one of those, I can't say the word quiet, that's banned in the newsroom, but one of those months that's supposed to be a bit calmer, let's say, and it hasn't been. And we really wanted to delve into the foreign policy aspect of President Trump's administration and his strategy, because obviously that has been front and center with the Ukraine war. And to talk a bit about where things head next. You know, we saw this pretty stunning summit in Alaska with President Putin. We saw pretty much, the eminence of European leaders on hand at the White House on Monday. Bernd and I were both there, kind of watching these leaders file into the White House and some open press opportunities. So for Ukraine, the big question is going to be security guarantees going forward. And I think, it's fair to say that this is a big open question, isn't it?
It is a big open question because no one has really been able to say what exactly that looks like. In particular, from the White House's perspective, what exactly the U.S. involvement there is. Trump seemed to suggest some sort of air support at one point, but even then, there's a lot of questions. I mean, what exactly does that mean? I mean, is it kind of as they did in Iraq after the first Gulf War, kind of a no-fly zone? And then Caroline Levitt said it's more about coordination, and that's even, I mean, to me at least, that seemed like an even less clear indication of what the U.S. exactly sees itself doing here. Because what does coordination exactly mean? So I just think there's quite a few like open questions about what that even looks like if we get to a point where the security needs to be guaranteed, which is in question at the moment, at least.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that, the US is just not fully committed to anything. Increasingly throughout the week, we've heard a lot of different messages from a lot of different people. We've heard the president say one thing one day, he was open to boots on the ground. Then he was very definitive that there would be no boots on the ground. Um, but we know that they are very much looking to Europe to really shoulder the burden of these security guarantees. I mean, one of the more interesting moments I thought where we had something a bit concrete was when Zelensky gave a press conference after his meetings at the White House, and he said that there would be a $90 billion deal between the U.S. and Ukraine for arms, including aviation systems, anti-missile systems. And then he also said that the U.S. would commit to buying Ukrainian drones, which would help boost domestic production. So, I mean, that's something, but even that hasn't been fully hammered out. And I think a lot of the contours of what this looked like will take shape with these ongoing conversations that have been going on between the U.S. and their European counterparts this week.
I was trying to put myself in the mindset of the European leaders as they're looking kind of to the next steps. You know, President Trump has talked about this bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Putin. And it really must be difficult to kind of nail the administration down on what exactly it's going to do in terms of support. So you have Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's spearheading the security guarantees aspect. But there's reporting in Politico on the one hand that the U.S. is willing at this point to provide, this is according to the Pentagon, really minimal security guarantees, not even air cover, because that can involve U.S. pilots, American pilots, then directly engaging with Russia, which is not something that some of Donald Trump's allies necessarily want to see. And for a long time, for Donald Trump, strategic ambiguity has been part of his negotiating strategy. But the problem is when you get to an actual peace agreement that has to be implemented on the ground, you need concrete words on paper. And it's not clear to me that the Europeans actually even are certain that the US and President Trump would honor guarantees and that they're willing to put something to paper. So I really wonder what the next weeks of negotiating this aspect in particular will look like.
I think that's kind of going to be kind of a long running conversation, especially, at one point during these negotiations, the US seemed to signal kind of a willingness to implement something like Article 5 of NATO, in which if one member is attacked, all are attacked. But then if there is that risk aversion about US personnel even being there, or I mean, even NATO personnel could kind of be problematic if that's kind of the approach that they're taking. I think they kind of slowly walked away from that as the week went on, and it just there isn't doesn't seem to be any sort of kind of firm dedication to putting any U.S. assets in any place where this could become an issue, which makes the whole wider issue of the security guarantees super problematic, I think.
And I think, one of the biggest takeaways from this week was that, the reality that they're not close to a peace deal, right? I mean, you have the Russia piece here as well, where you have, Moscow's foreign minister coming out and saying that they have to be a part of any sort of post-war security agreement. They want veto power, which of course, Ukraine is not going to get behind. And so the reality is, everybody's looking at Washington. Everybody's trying to figure out how they can influence Donald Trump in, his role in this whole process. And I think part of, one of the more extraordinary things we saw, which is all the European officials come on Monday, drop their plans and show up, is getting them to see it, is shifting his stance, right? And getting him to see it through the European lens. So when a deal is actually on the table or attainable, that he's looking at it from their vantage point. And I think there's a lot of, jostling between, Putin, Trump calling Putin on Monday, mid-meeting with the European leaders, him still having the president's ear. And then you have the European leaders here who are also trying to just get the president to look at it from their vantage point as these conversations take place, and a deal or some version of it might start to take shape again.
I think also from a messaging standpoint, one of the issues the White House has had was that they've not been able to say, at least publicly, what leads them and President Trump to think that Russia is serious about a deal itself. When they've been asked about that, they just say, because of conversations we've had. But, just in the days after the European leaders were at the White House, there was one of the most significant drone and missile attacks from Russia on Ukraine, which hit, I might add, one of the places in which the U.S. is investing money in Ukraine. And, part of the previous conversation had been that, U.S. investment in Ukraine would somehow deter Russia, and Russia offering to have those talks, those bilateral or trilateral talks in Moscow. I mean, to many people, including to many people in Ukraine's government, that suggests that Russia isn't anywhere near as serious as the other parties about this actually coming to the table. And I think until the White House is able to explain why they think that's the case, they'll keep getting that question.
Well, and I think that underlines what I see as a fundamental mismatch here, and that is that President Trump, he understands and has said that President Putin sees Ukraine as the apple of his eye. He's always wanted all of Ukraine. But President Trump tends to view these negotiations through a transactional lens. And for Vladimir Putin, this is ideological. This is about, the collapse of the Soviet Union being, to him, in his view, the greatest tragedy, and Ukraine being part of Russia's sphere. And that makes it far more difficult for the White House to be able to push forward negotiations on the kind of scale or playing field that Donald Trump might be used to. And then you have the added complication for Donald Trump and his administration that they know well that many members of their base are not that interested in this war. They don't necessarily want to engage with it. In fact, I was trying to figure out some numbers on this, and I saw that there was the Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll earlier this month. It's a small poll, it's a singular poll, but still, they polled around 2,100 adults and found that 6 in 10 continue to support the U.S. sending arms and military supplies to Kyiv. And then the most substantial shifts are among Republicans, so plus 9 percentage points for economic assistance and plus 21 on military aid. So again, one poll. But you do wonder that if some of the shifting language that we've seen from the president on putting pressure on Ukraine and trying to push Ukraine to make territorial concessions, for example, whether that's supported by a number of members of his base or Republican Party, and on the other hand, you have Steve Bannon and MAGA warriors, if you will, saying we don't want anything to do with security guarantees in Ukraine. We don't want anything that would drag the U.S. into some sort of regional or global war.
I think the Steve Bannon stuff is interesting. I was listening to his podcast after the meeting on at the White House, and he made the point, which I think many people in the MAGA base are probably broadly sympathetic with, that there is no even minimal U.S. involvement in a security guarantee that wouldn't cost American money and wouldn't take American, at the very least, equipment. Which is all very expensive. So I think people within that base and some people I was speaking to in the last couple of days, they just don't see how that can be part of an America first agenda. And I think if we get a clearer picture of how much this costs, for example, or how much commitment the U.S. has to put on in Ukraine in terms of material or personnel. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more of that from people like Steve Bannon, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are been very, very vocal about the U.S. just washing its hands of Ukraine, Gaza, and really any other global conflict.
There's a couple of things. I think that one of the things they're going to have to work out is how to make these security guarantees legally binding, and whether that is going to require congressional approval. So again, this might be something that the White House has to sell to Congress as well. Particularly, as you said, like some of these Republicans who might be, more averse to deeper involvement and a hefty price tag. I think the price tag is going to matter. I also think the timeline is going to matter. I mean, the politics of it, unfortunately, heading into the midterm elections, if this drags out and butts up against those elections, this is going to be a hard pill to swallow for some of those Republicans who are up. If it's a big price tag, if there's a lot of involvement, particularly when, the president spent a good chunk of his campaign promising to get out of some of these wars, particularly this one. And then, of course, Gaza. But it's, I think timeline here is really going to be a huge issue. And, as we've seen, Vladimir Putin is just looking to buy time. And it appears Zelensky might be as well, but it's really going to matter when this all sort of comes to fruition and what the reality is of the politics in the U.S. at that time as well.
Timing's a really interesting point, Courtney, and both of you have mentioned Gaza. And, President Trump has said that Ukraine is perhaps the most complicated war and one that's been more difficult to solve. We've talked many times about the fact that he said he would solve it in a day, and it's obviously proven to be the most difficult for his administration to tackle. But, we haven't really heard the Trump administration in recent weeks speaking much about Gaza. Of course, we've seen a few posts from Donald Trump on Truth Social talking about the hostages needing to be released. But there is this continuous, very tenuous negotiation happening between all the mediating parties on trying to reach some sort of ceasefire agreement, all while the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, despite international condemnation and we've seen that from many European countries, is now planning this offensive in Gaza City and occupation of Gaza. And you get the sense that there's just not much from the White House at all on this.
I think it was really telling in the Oval Office when Zelensky and the other European leaders were there, that at one point Trump was kind of listing things that he's done and that he still thinks need to be done internationally. He didn't mention Gaza. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but he just kind of skipped over it. And in the past there'd been some suggestion that if negotiations in Ukraine or in Gaza don't go anywhere, that the US would walk away. And one wonders if they haven't kind of reached that point. I mean, I was at the White House a few weeks ago when Trump came out on the lawn to leave, and he said, I always said that when the very few hostages left, this is when it's going to get difficult. And I just think Israel needs to finish the job now. And I think since then, there's been kind of crickets from the White House in terms of, for example, Israeli preparations for a wider offensive in Gaza. They just seem to have kind of turned their focus away from that, at least, publicly on the face of it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we're always in the case where there are competing interests in foreign policy, and, sometimes it's the main thing that they're focused on, and sometimes it falls to the back burner. Obviously, Ukraine is taking a front seat at this point, but even this, I think there was a couple telling things. One, the killing of the journalist. When Caroline Levitt was asked about that, she demurred. She said she wasn't going to get ahead of the president on this. She was waiting for him to comment on it, and we hadn't heard from him. And then even this week, with Hamas saying they accepted a proposal for a ceasefire from Egyptian and Qatari negotiators, and as Israel, began its operations in Gaza City, we haven't heard the president. He's been largely silent on this, and it's an issue that he played a major role in January during the transition and getting that hostage deal over the line. But then, he supported Israel when they resumed, air and ground operations in March. And so he sort of seems to just be letting Netanyahu sort of take the lead on this and giving him the space to do what he wants. And, we saw in a Truth Social post earlier this week that he said that Hamas must be confronted and destroyed in order to ensure the return of the remaining hostages, and that's largely in line with what we've heard from Netanyahu. So it just, unfortunately, it seems that the administration is focused elsewhere at this point, but there has to be a breaking point at some point.
I think one of the main differences is that with Gaza, even after countries like the UK, France, Canada expressed a willingness to recognize a Palestinian state, there's nothing like the pressure campaign of a bunch of foreign leaders coming to the White House to make that case for the Palestinians in person at the White House. It's just that's an order of magnitude above anything else in terms of just kind of the public kind of need the public image of urgency. Even when Trump was with Prime Minister Starmer in Scotland and the issue came up, there wasn't anything near the same sort of kind of push from him or from other European leaders at the time that we saw at the White House when Zelensky was there with the rest of them the other day.
Yeah, there's the practical matter that you have Steve Witkoff, of course, now serving as President Trump's envoy for Ukraine as well, negotiating. There have been questions asked, as you both know, about his ability to negotiate the Russia-Ukraine talks at the moment, and that he might have misunderstood some of what Russia's aims are. And of course, if he is busy with that, the practicality of it is that, of course, he can't be as engaged with negotiations on the war in Gaza. And then, you wonder, because President Trump, and I know we can talk about this as well, is really keen to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be seen as the peacemaker, the deal maker, of course. And that has eluded him with the war in Ukraine so far. But Gaza is actually the war where he does wield considerable influence. He does have that relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu that if you were to say to him, enough, stop the war, it's time to negotiate on releasing the hostages and also serving the civilians in Gaza who are suffering, that would be a real possibility. And you get the sense that that type of pressure he could exert would also be effective on Hamas as well. And yet he's chosen not to do so, partly because, of course, the very pro-Israeli stance of many members of his party and the relationship he has with the Israeli prime minister. But you do get the sense that he has made the choice to walk away from this conflict in the moment, allow Israel not only to pursue its aims, but even expand on them, as we've talked about this offensive in Gaza, without any real pushback. And if he were to insert himself into the negotiations at the moment, it could really have an impact.
Yeah, I think so. I also think, though, his hand may be forced next month at the UN General Assembly.
Yeah.
We
Yes.
see the question of a Palestinian state really front and center and we see a public global pressure campaign. I mean, he will have to respond. And so he may have to turn his attention back to this issue in September.
But it comes back, doesn't it, guys, to this fact that President Trump, he's really interested in his image and his legacy. All presidents are. We know President Biden, chief among them, was constantly talking about his legacy, wasn't he? Or planning for it. So that's not much of a surprise. But he really sees, President Obama's being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize as a slight, and sees himself as first in line for this. And you really think, the White House consistently, as we've all been covering all week, talking about 6 wars, 6 months that President Trump has solved, talking about the fact that he wants to go to heaven, as Caroline Leavitt has talked about in her press briefings when she was asked about that, that this really does matter to the president. I don't know if it's really, the war in Ukraine that he thinks will get him there, but it seems to be a real priority.
I think it absolutely matters to him, and the sign of that is just how often he brings it up now. Almost in every remarks he gives in like a spray in the Oval Office, it comes up. They're going with 7 wars now, and it just seems to have kind of injected some fuel into his desire for this, especially after Pakistan and India and Cambodia and Thailand. Some leaders in those countries, expressed a willingness to nominate him. It just seemed to kind of inject more urgency for him in terms of getting this done. But I do think from the perspective of many people at the White House, Ukraine would be what clinches it, because that's what the war he was talking about on the campaign trail. That's the war that's kind of defined, the U.S. relationship with Russia and with Europe since February of 2022. I think they very much see that as the what would be the icing on the cake, in which the other 7 wars wouldn't matter nearly as much or be mentioned nearly as much if he gets either that or Gaza, which are perhaps in the American public consciousness a lot more than Cambodia or Thailand or Kosovo or any of the other conflicts that he's mentioned, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Those are the 2 that Americans are really kind of watching. So I think, for them, it's very much part of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, particularly because he ran on an America First agenda. It's part of his brand. He's all about, a domestic agenda and pulling the U.S. out of, a lot of these conflicts and their, U.S. leadership on the world stage. And he is so focused and so fixated on the idea that he could be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And as Byrne was alluding to, I mean, all of these war are not the same. And, what counts as a war, what's active, what's, with Ukraine, with regard to Ukraine and Gaza, those are 2 active global conflicts in a way that maybe, some of these other conflicts he's talked about playing a role in. There's been some questions around what constitutes him solving a war. But yeah, I mean, this is a guy who is so obsessed with his reputation. I mean, all presidents, of course, as you mentioned, Sumi, are looking at their legacy, trying to measure what that would look like.
Well, maybe, next week or the week after, we're sitting here talking about the end of one of these wars. That would be a great thing, but certainly it's going to keep us busy watching how these negotiations develop on Ukraine and Gaza in the weeks to come. But we've run out of time. So great to see you guys, and see you again next week.
See you guys.
Soon. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.